Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Podcast Daily. It is Tuesday, and the off-season workouts are in full swing at Ohio State. It's about that time where we're going to start seeing crazy mat drill videos and people talking about gains and getting ready for spring ball, which is actually not that far away. It looks like, based on the calendar, we don't have a definitive date for it yet, Bill Landis, but it'll be about 5 weeks away. The Buckeyes will be getting back out there, maybe 6. But that is pretty crazy. We're in this weird, the weird dry spell, but it only lasts for like a week, and then everything goes crazy again.
Yeah, sometimes people ask me, like, what do you guys do in the off season? I was like, well, it doesn't really exist anymore. It's I used to think like covering college football was so much better than covering the NFL because the NFL just is never off. There's always something going on. And now college football is basically the same thing. Like at this time of year, it gets a little slow for like a week or two, and then maybe in like May and June you get a week or two where things are a little slow. But by and large, there is no more off season with college football, and we're just kind of, I don't know, waiting for the next thing on the calendar to pass. We just had the NFL draft deadline. There's a signing day next week, and then before you know it, spring practice will be here.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. And you can't say that June is quiet anymore because now you have, at least not around Berm, you can't say that because they have 5, 6, 7 recruiting camps, and you and I both go. And I try to just stay out of Berm's way, but I do go and watch a little bit. But yeah, it's wild how college football has become more of that year-round sport. We try to do some longer, featurey stuff like we've been doing with the Cam Brown series, but even trying to work that in gets challenged and compromised at times because, spring ball is around the corner, workouts and everything else. So with those in mind, as mat drills gets ramped up, Bill and I decided that we would talk about a couple guys that we think need the next 4 or 5 weeks, really maximize that, maybe carry in some momentum to spring ball, whether that's maybe proving that they're ready for more leadership or just because they need to bulk up and let Mickey Marotti do his thing. So it's a wide open way to address this topic, but where would you begin, Bill?
I would begin, shockingly, on the offensive line.
Nah, you don't say.
with Zen Mohalski, who it seems like from the way that this offseason has transpired up to this point, not anticipating Ohio State adding another offensive lineman before spring practice begins. I'm not envisioning Vic Cutler, the lineman that they got from Louisiana Monroe, to be a factor in the tackle conversation. So it seems like Zen is going to get every opportunity in the world to stake a claim to that left tackle job. I'm assuming Josh Fryar is going to be the right tackle. I suppose Josh could play on the left and Zen could be the right. But regardless, an open tackle job for Zen Mohalski seems to be there for the taking. And he's a guy who seemed to really make the most of last offseason and position himself like as a 2-deep guy, a player that Ohio State at the time was talking about, like, give it a year and we think he can be someone who's legitimately contending for a starting job. Well, like, now that's here. So what needs to, I guess, get further ramped up for Zen as he prepares to attack that? Because honestly, if you look at the roster, there's not even much in the way of like someone else to battle him for that job. There's just not a whole lot of tackle depth on this roster at the moment. So it's really all there for him to kind of attack and take and make his own, and then see where that leaves him in Ohio State at the conclusion of spring practice. But it starts now, or it has started already, I suppose. They're not starting winter drills today; they're already underway. So what is Zen doing, I guess, with that new mindset, knowing that he is positioned to play a premier position in this offense in the fall?
Yeah, and I think especially you could say anybody on the offensive line within reason. I mean, Matthew Jones and Donovan Jackson have enough starting experience and physical development that you'd say maybe that's not the case, although Donovan Jackson is still relatively young in that process, just a couple of years into it. But it takes so long to physically mature enough to play on the offensive line. I think that's why this conversation about Zen Mohalski, and even to a lesser extent Josh Fryar, especially given some of the injuries that he had to work through and how much that maybe have set him back or held him back last year, I don't know. But, it's the extremely rare offensive lineman who's going to come in and play at a high level or start within the first 2 years. And you shouldn't even want that. I mean, honestly, unless you're at the very tip top of the 2 or 3 prospects every single year who seem to be able to to handle that, it really creates more issues than it might solve to go that way. So now, I don't, as it relates to Ohio State specifically, you're talking about there just not being a tremendous amount of depth at tackle. Now that's a problem. Like that's maybe why they wind up in a spot where you have to skew a little bit younger than they would, depending on what happens in January, February, March, and April before they decide what they may need to do in the transfer portal window in May. But yeah, all those guys up front, I think that's very critical. You could just throw a blanket over the entire offensive line group and say this is critical for these guys. But to specify one and single it out, Zen Michalski is probably that guy.
He is, and if I had to pick another one, because I'll talk about offensive line all day, it's Tegra Shabola, which I think was pointed out maybe to you and me on Twitter not that long ago. Like, hey, why are you guys talking about Tegra? Which I think is a fair point because he cracked the 2 deep as a true freshman last year, and actually, if I'm not mistaken, he was not early enrolled, so he did that. He should have been June and then was able to do that. And he has positional versatility too. So when we're going to talk about the open tackle position or potentially an open position on the interior of the offensive line, I think you need to consider him as well. And there's a handful of guys now who have been in the program for basically a year, but haven't gone through this part of the calendar, this winter conditioning into spring ball period. And Tegra is one of them. So he's another guy I'd have my eye on.
Yeah, I would say up until now, it's just generally the way that I've covered this team goes back to what I just said before. Going into year 2, or without having the benefit of a full spring ball or whatever happens, like maybe they could change my mind in March and April and that conversation would shift. But Ohio State, whether that was Greg Studrawa before or even in the early stages here with Justin Fry, it was like not looking for somebody in year 2 to really make that jump. You'd have to be one of those tip-top special guys. Paris Johnson did that. Donovan Jackson did a year ago. It does happen. It certainly does. But mostly it's a combination of philosophical belief that they're not ready, or evaluating physically where they need to go, or the fact that they were much more better stocked and better equipped with existing upperclassmen on the offensive line, didn't have to get into that situation. So that's not where they are right now. This is, I remember even covering a year where Ohio State had to turn over 4 out of 5 starting offensive linemen. It still felt like they had more depth than this particular one does at the moment. Now we'll see if I still feel that way in April, but that's certainly the way it looks now.
Yeah, it's weird because I think they have now, with the addition of Vic Cutler, I think they're at 17 or 18 scholarship offensive linemen, which is a really big number, but like 4 of them have played. So it's kind of a weird position to be in.
Yeah, it's hard for me to wrap my mind around that situation. Like, okay, yes, there is a lot of beef out there, just not maybe grade A experienced beef.
That's right, yeah.
Okay, that's the offensive line. Let's move on. I know you want to keep talking about it. Let's not.
Yeah, well, there's plenty of time to talk more about that, and believe me, we will. When we decided we were going to kind of chat about this, honestly, the first player that came to mind to me was not an offensive lineman, believe it or not. It was Tyleik Williams, and part of that I think is the actual conditioning part of it. Like we've talked with him before about having to get to a place where he can just play more, have a little more stamina, be more of an every down defensive tackle. And I think he made steps in the right direction with that last year. Also, he was pretty transparent, I think, at times with his unhappiness with his role. Like it just seemed very clear, I think, to everybody who was paying attention that Tyleik wanted to play more. He will have abundant opportunities to do so. They're losing a lot at defensive tackle. Returning is really just him and Mike Hall and Ty Hamilton, and that's kind of it. It's another position where you look at the depth and you're like, boy, there are not a lot of guys who have played a lot of football at this position. So I don't know what Ohio State's going to do to address that. I think you want to see a guy like Hero Kanu take some steps and probably play more next year, and maybe Will Smith or Caden McDonald, one of the true freshmen, can do so. But I think the more likely scenario is that the older players who have played are going to have to play a whole lot more, and perhaps even more than Ohio State defensive tackles have played here in quite some time, because I don't think Larry Johnson's going to have the luxury of rotating 4 or 5 guys at that position like he has in years past. Right now, I'd say you have 3. So Tyleik Williams, probably chief among that group, I think needs to make some more strides in that direction that I mentioned to get himself ready to be a guy who can play 30, 40, maybe even 50 snaps a game for a defense that's going to really need his what I consider to still be a considerable upside. But that starts now. That making the steps towards that doesn't just suddenly like begin in August. It starts with the mat drills and the winter conditioning and the weightlifting now to turn yourself into that kind of player. So I think maybe perhaps more than anybody, he has the most to gain out of this time period.
Are you suggesting that 91 might be freed?
I'm suggesting that there is ample opportunity for him to be freed should he embrace the things that need to be embraced to put himself in that scenario.
Yeah, I agree. And I was thinking about the interior of the defensive line as well, but the name that I thought was probably more pressing. I do agree with everything you said, but I was thinking more about Hero Kanu and some of the, unique physical tools that he would bring to Ohio State or is bringing to Ohio State, what that would look like after, the next 6 weeks of workouts for him. You could see, I he didn't get to play much or hardly at all, but you saw in September why maybe that was, just walking around the facility or walking into, the horseshoe on a game day, a little bit of, baby fat, and that's not to be not to catch anybody by surprise. That's the way it works when you are a freshman. And he's got a lot to learn about playing the game. I'm not sure what the next step actually looks like coming out of workouts and getting through March and April at that position for him, just with that body of work. Still so young in all of that capacity, but I think it's important to see that because he's got some ability to do things on the interior, potentially stopping the run, especially, that Ohio State's going to need to address. And as you alluded to, they don't have a ton of guys really in a position to do that. So the chance to play will be there for him. Now, is he able to make the most of that in these workouts? I've not heard anybody say that he doesn't have the mindset for it, or the mentality for it, or the work ethic to do it. So if he embraces that challenge and you get out there in the first or second week of March, and he could look like a very different person. And I expect to see that from him. And if that's the case, then what does that look like? Because there is going to be a little bit of shift going on there on the defensive line when you don't have, Teron Vincent first and foremost, but a couple other guys, even Zach Harrison on the edge. Like, there's just going to be a little bit of, I think, some moving pieces going on. We talked about finding the right way to use Jack Sawyer. How does that influence some of those other things? I think that this isn't a make or break point for Hero Kanu because he's at such an early point in his career, but it is a critical one where if he wants this season to play out and maybe jump ahead of schedule slightly, this is the time of year where you could do that.
It is, and I think too, and this is not to put too much on Hero, because I agree with you. He's so early in his development that it would make sense to me if maybe he wasn't quite ready to make that leap. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that he's not, and you come out of spring thinking like, well, we got 3. Then I think you have to start having the transfer portal conversation and see if there's an opportunity to add some depth at defensive tackle. But right. Hero Kanu can change that calculus, I think, very quickly. He is from a combination of size and then like strength and explosive ability. I don't think there have been many defensive tackles like him at Ohio State. You get like facets of that, like a guy who's really explosive but perhaps a bit undersized, a guy who's really like brute strong like Devon Hamilton and maybe doesn't have that devastatingly quick first step, but Devon Hamilton is really good. He starts for the Jaguars, but I think that Hero has the opportunity to be a really sort of like fully formed kind of with an expansive game at defensive tackle that Ohio State is not necessarily accustomed to having. And he also too, and this is more from camp settings, but I think you can get a vibe from that. He seems to really enjoy playing football, which I think is a mindset that lends itself to making those kind of critical gains in an offseason like this, because it's hard. We had Bobby Carpenter talking about it on the Rooster Show, and we talked to him when we're not recording too about how difficult this time of year is for guys. And I think if you're the kind of player who truly loves just kind of playing the game and embraces the idea of wanting to get better, that suits you well this time of year. And Hero seems to have that. And if he does, then I think he's a guy we'll be talking about for the next few months.
Yeah, he's maybe not. I guess I'd have to look and compare some of the weight, but I think he's got the ability to be everything you described on the interior. Someone who had that all-around package. I think the best example, maybe in the time that I covered Ohio State, would be Jonathan Hankins. And I don't know if that's a fair comparison to make for Hero Kanu or not. That's a lofty standard. A guy who's now been in making, earning paychecks at the NFL level for a decade on the interior. I think that there's the possibility that could happen. I'm not expecting by the end of April for Hero Kanu to remind me of what Jonathan Hankins looked like after 3 years or 4 years at Ohio State. But, I think what you're talking about, Bill, is that there's not been somebody who has that kind of quickness and sort of nimble feet at that size, well over 300 pounds, the ability to stop the run, and obviously not out there for pure pass rush ability, but can collapse a pocket if need be. Again, that's too much maybe to put on Hero Kanu, but it's been a long time, is the point, since Ohio State has had somebody who's really played up at that weight and did it at a level that the NFL scouts took notice of and that caused so much disruption right there at the point of attack.
Hero is listed at 305 pounds, which feels a little low to me.
That's not, yeah. That does not qualify you as big time Hank level. You need about 30 more pounds. And that's why I said I don't know what he's at right now. And I don't know what he will be in March, April, March or April either. Like, that's sort of the intrigue. I don't know what's going to happen for him coming out of winter workouts.
Yeah, that's a pretty good sort of ball of clay there, I think, for Mick Mirati and his staff to work with. And the other thing, just before we talk about some other guys, just a reminder, like, for people, like, Hero has not been playing football all that long. He's from Europe. I think he came over to start playing high school football in the States as a junior in high school. So this is like his third year, going into his fourth year of like really playing football at any kind of meaningful level. And despite that, he is very, very highly regarded and well thought of, and I think has a tremendously high ceiling. So he is a player to get excited about for sure, and a guy that I'm very curious to see what kind of physical transformations he can make here over the next few weeks and months.
Okay. Checked off both lines.
I have one more on the defensive line.
Okay,
quickly.
let's hit it.
Kenyatta Jackson.
You don't have to go quickly, Bill. We got all the time.
Kenyatta Jackson, another guy, he was also not here this time last year. He was a June enrollee, and he's probably, like, if you look at his listed weight, you probably think, oh, that's a little light for a defensive end. But if you look at him, he's got like it looks like he's built like an aircraft carrier. He's just like, you can land a fighter jet on his back. I talk about, like, again, like a guy that you get him in the weight program and like see how he comes out on the other end. I think that's a guy who we can come out in spring practice and we're like, whoa, look at this dude. And that's another position too, that's returning JT Tuimoloau and Jack Sawyer, and not much else besides those two. Mitchell Melton, we'll see how he can come back from the knee if he's able to give it a go again. But and Caden Curry obviously is in that mix as well. But another position group that could really use a young player or two stepping up. And Kenyatta Jackson, who was like a top 100 high school player who looks the part, didn't get a chance to play much last year, but I think is a guy who can make a little bit of a leap here as we get into his second year in the program.
Both Kenyatta Jackson and Amari Abor caused a little bit of stir with some social media stuff related around the transfer portal window and uncertainty about that before that closed, and it seemed like Ohio State, quote unquote, survived whatever was going on there. Again, it can be a dangerous game to read anything into what anybody does on social media.
That's right. Yeah.
Let alone trying to interpret emotions outside of Free 91. I think we know what that means. It's pretty self-explanatory.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, both of those guys are pretty impressive physical specimens, and they came in with high recruiting pedigrees, and everybody knows what Larry Johnson can do when he's teaching pass rush technique to guys with high level ceilings like that. So that's a pretty key element here. Mickey Marotti doing his thing, getting 6 weeks of that before going into spring ball, where really, Larry Johnson and Jim Knowles and everybody else can just teach fundamentals and scheme and take the next step with them. We've heard from Bosa's and Chase Youngs and everybody on down the line that it's year 2 where Larry Johnson and the defensive ends really need to make that jump and where they feel like they can. So that's going on for those two. We'll see how it works for them. Really key. I mean, it's key everywhere. Ohio State's trying to win national championships. We're not just talking about guys who are trying to, skip over from being a 2-star diamond in the rough and contribute to a middle of the road Big Ten team. I mean, we're talking about 4- and 5-star prospects trying to become all Americans and trying to compete for national championships. Like, it's a different sort of thing that we're talking about. And it's not, it doesn't mean that none of these guys have lived up to expectations, because at least for year one, Ohio State's not a program where you're looking for true freshmen to be out there playing. So I realize that I'm skipping around a little bit on that, but we're not bringing up these guys, I guess, because we think that they've been disappointments. It's more that they're at positions where Ohio State needs them to take a step forward.
Yeah, it does. I'd have to look this up, so I'll say this and potentially be wrong, but it feels like Ohio State is in a position, for whatever reason, to need more of that this year, like more of year two guys to step forward maybe than perhaps they've been in the past. So the urgency feels a little bit greater, or a sense of urgency feels greater, but it's not an indictment on anything those guys did in their first year. Like, it's not guys exploding onto the scene in their first year, like being game wreckers and really important contributors, is not a normal thing, as you said, at a program like Ohio State. It does happen occasionally. There's a handful of guys, or less than that, every year who seem to do so, but not doing it in year one, doesn't preclude you from doing it down the road. It just does feel like, for whatever reason, they need perhaps more of that than I initially anticipated going into this offseason. It would do a lot, I think, to allay concerns at various points across the roster if they can get a couple of guys to do that.
Yeah, that's right. Amongst the skill position guys, everything would be about the same, I think, that we'd say for the wide receivers.
Yeah.
I would throw out Caleb Burton first and foremost, because I think it certainly caught my attention before the Peach Bowl when CJ Stroud dropped his name first amongst that group. Again, small sample size, but I think that out of that four from that class a year ago that weren't able to make an impact, even when it looked like there was enough opportunity for them to do so, the reasons are different for all four of them. I think for Caleb Burton specifically, it was a little bit of more of the mental side and developing practice habits that are required at this level. And when CJ Stroud talked about, to me, Caleb Burton's improved maturity or enhanced maturity, that resonated. Like, physically, he's got the skills to do that, and he has had enough development opportunities playing football down in Texas, and certainly has a father who's coached in that at that level for a long time. He knows what it takes, or he should have known what it takes. And for whatever reason, it just took a little bit longer for that to connect, and it didn't get on the field to make any kind of impact as a true freshman. Again, not the worst thing in the world for sometimes guys to go through that and learn from the sideline and have to get pushed a little bit through workouts. And having Brian Hartline overseeing your development is generally a pretty positive thing in the long run. So that could be good for him. See what that means. There's more guys coming to push at wide receiver, and the competition is going to be pretty thick. It's going to be tough for everyone to survive it, if we're being honest, just based on the numbers there. So how you handle a full, your second go around in some of these cases, going through mat drills, going through winter conditioning, and then what shakes out when the opportunity is there to be a third, fourth, or fifth receiver potentially. Pretty big opportunity. Caleb Burton, I think, would be the one where I look first and foremost, but I think you could probably make a case for any of the four freshmen a year ago.
Yeah, I think they're all in the same spot. Caleb is, like, people might forget, at the time I believe that he committed to Ohio State, he was like a 5-star guy, that he was evaluated as the best among that group. And he got hurt and his ranking sort of suffered, but he has that injury now, I guess 2 years in the past. Maybe there was something to get over there for him too, in terms of the mental hurdle that comes with just being injured and kind of getting back to feeling like yourself again. But I think Ohio State would very much like a world where they don't have to play Marvin Harrison Jr. and Emeka Egbuka every single snap. And then people might think that's crazy and sounds counterproductive, but over the course of a long season, and Ohio State wants to play 15 games, I think you would like to be able to not have to rely on that pair on every single snap. Certainly you play them all the high leverage ones, but if you can get meaningful contributions from literally anybody else in that room, Julian Fleming obviously is in that conversation as well, and even Jaden Ballard, who's not in the same class as those guys, but really anyone who's not Marvin, Emeka, and Julian probably is feeling a little bit of a squeeze right now with the group that's coming in behind them, because this freshman class that's coming in is very good. They're not all here just yet. Some of them will be in for winter workouts, but and I'm not expecting anything really from that group as true freshmen, although I guess it could happen. It's more about that second year group and what they're able to do to keep a little bit of space between them and the group coming from behind them, and also attack an opportunity that seems to be in front of them to be the third or fourth or fifth guy in that rotation, and honestly play like meaningful snaps for Ohio State in the fall. Because I think Ryan Hartline and Ryan Day would very much appreciate if they did do that, so that Marvin and Emeka can be fresh at the end of the season.
I'm going to gamble and say that you feel the same as me, that Jair Brown is probably, if we're going to talk about the corners, maybe the one that we're expecting to see a big leap from, or thinking that's possible coming out of winter workouts and heading into spring. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's my gamble.
You would win that gamble. He seems to me like the kind of guy. You want to talk about someone who like understands the situation at hand and what's there for him, and then who might channel that into attacking it in the proper way. Like Jair seems to have the makeup to really do that. They need help at corner, and the staff clearly saw something in him last year to start him against Wisconsin. He played like around 200 snaps last year. There was a time where it looked like perhaps he was working himself into a consistent rotational role. It didn't quite work out that way, but I think there are things there that the coaching staff liked from him, and now he can build on top of that. And obviously Denzel Burke's back, Jordan Hancock is back. We know the staff thinks highly of him too, but you don't want to live in a world where you only have two corners that you can play. You want to be able to play 3 or 4. Ohio State's best defenses have done that. I think they'd like to get back to that. Whether or not they have even 4, I'm not sure. I think there's a pretty big question mark once you get past Jair Brown, but that is another guy for sure that I have in mind as someone who can help himself tremendously this winter by making physical gains, doing all the stuff in the weight room, but also probably cultivating a little bit of leadership too, as crazy as it sounds for a guy in his second year. I think that room will probably need it a little bit with what's leaving that position group.
Yeah, I think that maybe for year one, the thing for him was he looked like the skinniest guy on the team, maybe, which nothing wrong with that. I should take some cues from that and get on his diet plan. But you know, like I think he looked like he was around 170, 175, and that happens to a lot of those corners. You know, Cameron Brown, to be able to make the tackles and do other stuff and hold up physically, and even though he dealt with his own injury history, was playing, he told me, at about 195 throughout last year. So that's 20 pounds that you're looking to add at corner. Now, I'm not saying that he has to play at the exact same weight or do the exact same things that Cameron Brown did, but I'm just using that as a point of reference. What that means in terms of playing physically, adding the strength that's needed to, you know, play press coverage and fight hand to hand against veteran wide receivers is a big deal. And it's why you don't want true freshmen playing at a lot of spots, because that's a pretty big difference. Somebody who's had 4 or 5 years in a weight program and is carrying 20, 25 more pounds than you, probably going to be in line for a lot more snaps at the Big Ten level. So that's the part. Can you get through that? You don't have to worry about getting through weeks of practice right now. You know, you're going to have an opportunity more so than at any other point in the calendar, really, January and February, to hammer the weight program, eat a bunch of food, you know, do the things that help you gain weight and get stronger and then become more physically athletic and physically mature. That's the time for that. So we know that the mentality part and the work ethic part and the aggression that Jair Brown has that. So again, lumping him in that same category where you don't often think about the offseason program for corners, right? Like we started with the offensive and defensive line, and there's a reason for that. That's where you play football, but it's just as important. You're going to have to make a tackle one-on-one on the perimeter. Cornerbacks have to be ready and physically able to take down a running back. And we saw that Ohio State didn't struggle. It was not perfect with that last year. So there you go. I mean, it's just as critical as for a cornerback, even if they're not trying to make massive 60, 70 pound changes to their body.
I would like to see like a 240 pound cornerback, just to see what that looks like. But no, Ohio State doesn't need that. But yeah, that is a good point. He's listed as 180. Jair Brown is, but he did look a little.
That's another one. Yeah, it's another one that I dispute. I don't think that was.
Yeah, I have to talk with Jerry Emming about some of these heights and weights. see what's accurate, and then also talk to them who can get me to list me at a much lower weight than I actually am, because I would very much appreciate that.
We don't hand out programs on the podcast, so
we should start.
Oh, that might be the motivation that you and I need, right?
Yeah,
maybe. We got to the end of this and we just realized the irony after half an hour of you and I talking about the value of winter workouts for everybody else.
That's right.
So
that's right.
We're definitely qualified to do so. Don't worry about it. And hopefully that doesn't undermine everything else that came before on the podcast daily. But if it did, so be it. We'll be back again to talk about something else with Ohio State football on Wednesday. For Bill Landis, I am Austin Ward. Thanks for joining us. We'll talk to you again later.